Vanessa Cole had fired plenty of people over the years, but she would remember this one for the rest of her life. On a gray Tuesday morning outside her office in Charlotte, she watched her driver of 6 years hand a sandwich to a man sitting against the brick wall near the entrance, and something in her chest turned cold. She did not know his name. She did not want to know his name. All she knew was that a hungry stranger in a torn coat was standing too close to her reputation, and reputation was the only thing Vanessa Cole had ever trusted to keep her safe. What she could not have known was that in 72 hours, she would learn exactly who that man was, and the answer would break apart the version of herself she had spent 15 years building. Her voice did not rise. It never did. "You embarrassed me in front of my clients," she told Marcus Delaney, the man who had driven her to every meeting, every funeral, every quiet moment of grief for 6 unbroken years. "Pack your things." Marcus did not argue. He did not explain himself. He simply nodded, walked to his car, and left behind a man he had fed almost every morning for the better part of a year, a man whose face he had come to know better than his own reflection. Vanessa watched from the glass doors of her building as the old man clutched the sandwich Marcus had given him, and she felt nothing. Not yet. In 3 days, she would find out exactly who that man was, and she would spend the rest of her life wishing she hadn't fired the only person who ever tried to tell her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a single firing could unravel an entire family's history, you have to understand who Vanessa Cole was before that Tuesday morning. She had built her real estate firm from nothing after her family lost everything when she was 23, and she had told anyone who asked the same clean, controlled story. Her father had walked out. Her father had abandoned them when the money disappeared and never looked back. It was the story she gave to reporters, to boyfriends, to her own mother, in the rare moments her mother tried to bring him up. It was a story Vanessa needed to be true because the alternative, that he had not left them so much as vanished into something none of them understood, was a door she had shut a long time ago and refused to open again. Marcus Delaney's life ran on a much quieter frequency. He was a widower, raising a 9-year-old daughter with a heart condition that required medication he could barely afford some months. And he had driven for Vanessa Cole longer than almost anyone else on her staff had lasted. He was careful, precise, the kind of man who remembered which entrance she preferred on rainy days, without being told twice. He had never once mentioned the old man outside the building, not because he was hiding something, but because in 6 years, Vanessa Cole had never once asked him a question about his own life that wasn't about her schedule. So he never thought to ask her about her father either. He simply noticed that the old man flinched every single time Vanessa's voice came through the building's speaker system, and he never understood why until it was already far too late for it to matter to his paycheck. The old man himself had been sitting outside that building for almost 4 months by the time Marcus was fired, and in that time he had said almost nothing to anyone. The shelter workers a few blocks away knew him only as a quiet presence, who showed up for the insulin program every Thursday and rarely spoke above a whisper. He carried a photograph in his coat pocket that had gone soft and pale from years of handling, folded and refolded so many times the crease had worn nearly through the middle. He never showed it to anyone. He never explained why, some mornings, he sat facing the east entrance of that particular building instead of anywhere else in the city, as though he were waiting for something, or someone he could no longer put into words. By the time Vanessa fired Marcus, 3 separate lives that had never once touched each other in 15 years were about to collide inside a single week, and none of the 3 people at the center of it had any idea it was coming. The days that followed the firing did not feel remarkable to Vanessa Cole at first. She had let people go before, and life had always moved on quickly enough that she rarely thought twice about it. But something about the silence in the car on her way to work felt different now. The new driver her assistant hired within hours was competent enough, polite enough, forgettable in every way that mattered, and yet Vanessa found herself glancing toward the east entrance each morning out of habit, expecting to see the old man sitting there the way he always had. On the 3rd morning, he was gone. Not moved to another corner. Not resting somewhere nearby. Gone. As if he had simply stopped existing the moment Marcus stopped bringing him breakfast. It was a small detail, the kind of thing most people in her position would never have noticed at all, but it lodged itself in Vanessa's mind and refused to leave. It was her assistant, a sharp and quietly observant woman named Grace Whitman, who first noticed the irregularity in the building's community donation ledger. Vanessa's firm ran a modest outreach program, mostly for the sake of good publicity, funding a weekly insulin allowance for a handful of unhoused individuals registered through a downtown shelter. Grace had been reviewing the quarterly numbers when she noticed one name on the recipient list had been receiving the exact same dosage from the exact same supplier every single week for nearly a year, far longer than almost anyone else on the list. The account had been flagged anonymous at the donor's request from the very beginning, a detail nobody had questioned until now, because nobody had ever had a reason to look closely enough. Grace brought it to Vanessa almost as an afterthought, assuming it was nothing more than an accounting curiosity. Vanessa did not treat it as nothing. She told herself she was only checking because she did not want her company's name attached to a mistake if a reporter ever came asking questions. That was the story she repeated to herself as she drove, in someone else's car, to the shelter listed in the ledger. It was easier to believe she was protecting her reputation than to admit she was chasing a feeling she could not yet name. A small, persistent ache that had started the moment she saw the empty space where the old man used to sit. The shelter's caseworker, a soft-spoken man named Harold Briggs, pulled the intake file without much ceremony and handed it across the desk. The photograph inside was faded, taken months earlier under fluorescent light, but Vanessa recognized almost nothing in the tired, hollowed face staring back at her. Almost nothing, except the eyes. She left the shelter faster than she arrived, telling herself it was nothing, a resemblance, a trick of memory and guilt working together to manufacture ghosts where none existed. But that night she did something she had not allowed herself to do in over a decade. She opened the locked drawer in her home office, where her mother's old belongings had been sitting untouched since the funeral 3 years earlier, and she found the missing persons file her mother had quietly kept and never once mentioned. Vanessa had always believed her father left them. That was the story she built her entire adult life on top of, brick by brick, until it became load-bearing. But the file told a different story. Her father had never been declared dead. He had never been declared anything at all. He was simply listed, year after year, as missing. For 15 years, Vanessa Cole had told herself a story that made sense of her own pain. And for 15 years, that story had protected her from a truth she was not ready to hold. Her father, Thomas Cole, had not walked away from his family because he stopped loving them. He had disappeared because he could no longer face what he believed he had done to them. And somewhere between the shame and the silence, something in his mind had begun to slip away long before his body ever left the house. Vanessa sat with that file until the sun came up, staring at a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. A photograph that matched, detail for detail, scar for scar, the same faded intake photo Harold Briggs had shown her only hours earlier. She went back to the shelter the next morning, and this time she did not tell herself it was about the company. She asked to see him. Harold led her to a small common room where a handful of residents sat quietly with coffee and old newspapers. And there, by the window, sat the man from the photograph. Older now, thinner, his hands trembling slightly around a paper cup, but unmistakably her father. He did not recognize her at first. The illness had taken pieces of him that would never come back, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her the way he looked at every stranger who wandered into that room. Then, without any apparent reason, he said a name. Not Vanessa, a childhood nickname only her father had ever used, one she had not heard spoken aloud since she was 11 years old. The room did not feel real to her in that moment. Vanessa knelt beside his chair and took his hand, the same trembling hand that had once, months earlier, taken a sandwich from a driver she had fired for the crime of noticing a hungry man on a cold morning. Thomas Cole did not have the story ready for her the way she had rehearsed the confrontation in her mind 100 times on the drive over. He had no explanation prepared, no apology polished smooth by years of guilt. What he had instead, tucked inside his coat pocket, was the photograph he had carried and refolded so many times the crease had worn through the paper, a photograph of a much younger Vanessa on her 12th birthday, laughing, unaware that everything about her family was about to fall apart within the year. The truth came out slowly, in fragments, over several visits, some of it from Thomas himself, in his clearer moments, some of it pieced together by Vanessa, from old business records she had never thought to question. Her father had not lost the family fortune through recklessness or failure, the story she had told herself and everyone else for 15 years. He had taken the blame for a business partner's fraud, a decision that quietly protected Vanessa's mother from criminal prosecution at a time when the family had nothing left to fall back on. He believed, in the confused logic of a desperate man, that if he simply disappeared, the scandal would disappear with him, and his wife and daughter could rebuild without his name attached to the ruin. He never accounted for how long shame could hollow a person out from the inside, or how illness could quietly take root in the empty spaces guilt leaves behind. While Vanessa was piecing together her father's disappearance, she had not forgotten about Marcus Delaney, though guilt kept her from reaching out right away. When she finally tracked down his address, she learned he had already sold his car to cover a portion of his daughter's medical costs and taken a lower-paying position at a warehouse across town. The kind of job that offered no flexibility and no dignity for a man who had spent 6 years anticipating her every need before she asked. It was Harold Briggs, of all people, who delivered the detail that made the entire story fold in on itself. Marcus's late father, it turned out, had worked in that same shelter's kitchen for nearly a decade before he passed, ladling soup to the very man Marcus would one day feed a sandwich to, without ever knowing his name. Vanessa arrived at Marcus's small apartment on a Saturday afternoon, without an assistant, without a driver, without any of the armor she usually wore into a room. She did not lead with an apology, because she understood by then that an apology alone would never be enough to account for what her pride had cost him. She offered him his position back, not as a driver this time, but as a partner in a new community initiative her firm would be funding permanently, one built around the very man he had once fed breakfast to on a cold sidewalk. Marcus listened quietly, the way he always had, and for the first time in 6 years, Vanessa Cole actually waited for his answer instead of assuming it. Thomas Cole moved into a small guest house on Vanessa's property that same month, close enough that she could check on him each morning before work, far enough that he never felt like a burden being managed rather than a father being loved. On the mornings his mind was clear, he would sit by the window facing east, the same direction he used to face outside her office building. Except now he was waiting for nothing, because the person he had been waiting for was already home. Vanessa learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to feed her father the same simple, patient way Marcus once had, without cameras, without an audience, without the version of herself that needed the world to see her as untouchable. What this story leaves behind is a question worth sitting with long after the credits end. Vanessa Cole spent 15 years building a life around a story she never once tried to verify, a story that was easier to carry than the truth, until a moment of casual cruelty toward a stranger nearly cost her the one person who could have shown her where that stranger really came from. It makes you wonder how many of us are living beside our own answered prayers without ever once looking closely enough to recognize them. Would you have noticed the resemblance in that photograph? Would you have asked the questions Vanessa spent 15 years avoiding, or would you have kept walking, the way she almost did? If this story moved you, you will not want to miss what happens in our next case. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories.